The play takes place in a place that's called The Place, which is sort of a self-contained, about as big as it may be a football stadium or something, unit in outer space, where people are given kind of rest and relaxation from what's called the change wars, which they've been selected to be in. And the change wars are wars where the two sides, the spiders and the snakes, are each seeking to win final victory several million years in the future. And they do that, both sides, by plucking people out before they die in real life and resurrecting them somehow and recruiting them to fight in the change wars between the spiders and the snakes. And those wars consist of going back to previous times or future times and other places as well as times, and refighting certain battles and basically changing the course of history. And on the place, which is where, once again, the rest and recuperation happens, there's usually several soldiers there, some women who double as nurses and women of the night, as it were, and various people having discussions, sorting out what the heck they're doing there, and so on and so forth. And in the usual confusion that goes on in times of war, and you don't really know what orders are coming from above and what's happening, and different people have different speculations as to what's going on. And last time, excuse me, one of the characters seriously questioned a lot of what was going on in the place and bordered on mutiny of sorts, or at least talking about mutiny of sorts. And also in one of the change wars happening that was being conducted somewhere, there was talk of an atomic bomb being used. So a lot of talk about various issues. And then in our very last little bit, the maintainer ends up being missing. And the maintainer is a little radio-like device that is what keeps this place functioning out there in the middle of the void in outer space. It draws on the power of the local space and time and keeps the thing going. And that has been lost. And so there's a frantic ongoing search for finding the maintainer, because along with it being lost, the whole place sort of shuts down. It goes on introversion and kind of shuts down. And so coming up in what we'll be dealing with now is a lot of discussion about that, finding the maintainer, where can it be, and questions about what might happen to them in the future, and people going a little bit perhaps bonkers and so on, the kind of things that would happen if you were in a situation where you were confined with a group of people and not really in control. And with that, we once again welcome you and ask you to enjoy the show and make sure you're muted with cell phones off and that sort of thing. And thank you so much for your presence here. From Macbeth. My thought, whose murder yet is but fantastical, shakes so my single state of man, that function is smothered in surmise, and nothing is but what is not. Motives and opportunities.
My big bad waif from King's Lynn had set the tray on his knees and started to wolf the food down. The others were finishing up. Eric, Mark, and Cabby were having a quietly furious argument I couldn't overhear at the end of the bar nearest the bronze chest, and Lili was draped over the piano like a real octopus, listening in. Beau and Sevensee were pacing up and down near the control divan, and throwing each other a word now and then. Beyond them, Bruce and Lili were sitting on the opposite couch from us, talking earnestly about something. Maud had sat down at the other end of the bar and was knitting. It's one of the habits like chess and quiet drinking, or learning to talk by squeak box, that we pick up to pass the time in the place in the long stretches between parties. Doc was fiddling around the gallery, picking things up and setting them down, still managing to stay on his feet at any rate. Lili and Bruce stood up, still gabbing intently at each other, and Illy began to pick out with one tentacle a little tune in the high keys that didn't sound like anything on God's earth. Where do they get all that energy, I wondered. As soon as I asked myself that, I knew the answer and began to feel the same way myself. It wasn't energy, it was nerves, pure and simple. Change is like a drug, I realized. You get used to the facts never staying the same, and one picture of the past and future dissolving into another, maybe not very different, but still different, and your mind being constantly goosed by strange moods and notions, like nightclub lights of shifting colors with weird shadows between shining right on your brain. The endless swaying and jogging is restful, like riding on a train. You soon get to like the movement and to need it without knowing, and when it suddenly stops, and you're just you and the facts you think from and feel from are exactly the same when you go back to them. Boy, that's rough, as I found out now. The instant we got introverted, everything that ordinarily leaks into the place, wake or sleep, had stopped coming, and we were nothing but ourselves and what we meant to each other and what we could make of that. An awfully lonely, scratchy situation. I decided I felt like I'd been dropped into a swimming pool full of cement and held under until it hardened. I could understand the others bouncing around a bit. It was a wonder they didn't hit the void. Maud seemed to be standing at the best. Maybe she'd got a little preparation from the long watches between stars. And then she is older than all of us, even Sid, though with a small O in older. The restless work of the search for the maintainer had masked the feeling, but now it was beginning to come full force. Before the search, Bruce's speech and Eric's interruptions had done a passable masking job too. I tried to remember when I'd first got the feeling and decided it was after Eric had jumped on the bomb, about the time he mentioned poetry, though I couldn't be sure. Maybe the maintainer had been introverted even earlier, when I turned to look at the ghost girls. I wouldn't have known. Nuts. Believe me, I could feel that hardened cement on every inch of me. I remembered Bruce's beautiful picture of a universe without big change and decided it was about the worst idea going. I went on eating, though I wasn't sure now it was a good idea to keep myself strong. Does the maintainer have introversion telltale? City.
The death shit, and he loved me speak lower. Of a sudden I feel not well, as if I drunk a butt of radish and slept inside it. Mary, yes, blue, in short flashes, saith the manual. Why hast thou?
No reason. God, City, what I'd give for a breath of change wind.
Thou canst say that, eftsoons.
I must have looked pretty miserable myself, for he put his arm around my shoulders and whispered gruffly.
Comfort thyself, sweetling, that while we suffer thus sorely, we yet cannot die the change death.
What's that? I asked him. I didn't want to bounce around like the others. I had a suspicion I'd carry it too far. So, to keep myself from going batty, I started to rework the business of who had done what to the maintainer. During the hunt, there had been some pretty wild suggestions tossed around as to its disappearance, or at least its introversion. a feat of snake science amounting to sorcery, the spider high command bunkering the places from above, perhaps in reaction to the loss of the express room in such a hurry that they hadn't even time to transmit warnings, the hand of the lake cosmicians, those mysterious, hypothetical beings who are supposed to have successfully resisted the extension of the Change War into the future much beyond Seven Seas epoch, unless the late cosmicians are the ones fighting the Change War. One thing these suggestions had steered very clear of was naming any one of us as a suspect, whether acting as snake spy, spider political police, agent of, who knows, after Bruce, a secret Change World Committee of Public Safety, or spider revolutionary underground, or strictly on our own. Just as no one had piped a word since the maintainer had been palmed about the split between Eric's and Bruce's factions. Good group thinking, probably, to sink differences in the emergency, but that didn't apply to what I did with my own thoughts. Who wanted to escape so bad they'd introvert the place, cutting off all possible contact and communication either way with the cosmos, and running the very big risk of not getting back to the cosmos at all? Leaving out what had happened since Bruce had arrived and stirred things up, Doc seemed to me to have the strongest motive. He knew that Sid couldn't keep covering up for him forever, and that spider punishments for derelictions of duty are not just the clink of a firing squad, as Eric had reminded us. But Doc had been flat on the floor in front of the bar from the time Bruce had jumped on top of it, though I certainly hadn't had my eye on him every second. Beau? Beau had said he was bored with the place at a time when what he said counted, so he'd hardly lock himself in it maybe forever, not to mention locking Bruce in with himself and the babe he had a yen for. Sid loves reality, changing or not, and every least thing in it, people especially, more than any man or woman I've ever known. He's like a big-eyed baby who wants to grab every object and put it in his mouth. And it was hard to imagine him ever cutting himself off from the cosmos. Maud, Cabby, Mark, and the two ETs? None of them had any motive I knew of, though Seven Seas being from the very far future did tie in with that idea about the late cosmicians. And there did seem to be something developing between the Cretan and the Roman that could make them want to be introverted together. Stick to the facts, Greta, I reminded myself with a private groan. That left Eric, Bruce, Lili, and myself. Eric, I thought. Now we're getting somewhere. The little commandant has the nervous system of a coyote and the courage of a crazy tomcat. And if he thought it would help him settle his battle with Bruce better to be locked in with him, he'd do it in a second. But even before Eric had danced on the bomb, he'd been heckling Bruce from the crowd. Still, there would have been time between heckles for him to step quietly back from us, introvert the maintainer, and, well, that was 9/10 of the problem. If I was the guilty party, I was nuts, and that was the best exclamation of all. Grr. Bruce's motive seemed so obvious, especially the mortal, or was it immortal, danger he'd put himself in by inciting mutiny, that it seemed a shame he'd been in full view on the bar so long. Surely if the maintainer had been introverted before he jumped on the bar, we'd all have noticed the flashing blue telltale. For that matter, I'd have noticed it when I looked back at the ghost girls. If it worked as Sid claimed, and he said he'd never seen it in operation, just read in the manual, oh, Steph. But Bruce didn't need opportunity, as I'm sure all the males in the place would have told me right off, because he had Lili to pull the job for him, and she had as much opportunity as any of the rest of them. Myself, I have a large reservation to this woman putty in the hands of the man she loves madly theory, but I had to admit there was something to be said for it in this case, and it had seemed quite natural to me when the rest of us had decided by unspoken agreement that neither Lili nor Bruce's checks counted when we were hunting for the maintainer. That took care of all of us and left only the mysterious stranger, intruding somehow through a door, how he'd get it without using our maintainer, or from an unimaginable hiding place, or straight out of the void itself. I know that last is impossible. Nothing can step out of nothing. But if anything ever looked like it was specially built for something not at all nice to come looming out of it, it's the void, misty, foggily churning, slimy gray. Wait a second, I told myself, and hang on to this, Greta. They should have smacked you in the face at the start. Whatever came out of the void, or more to the point, whoever slipped back from our crowd to the maintainer, Bruce would have seen them. He was looking at the maintainer past our heads the whole time, and whatever happened to it, he saw it. Eric wouldn't have, even after he was on the bomb, because he'd been stage-wise enough to face Bruce most of the time, to build up his role as tribune of the people. But Bruce would have, unless he got so caught up in what he was saying. No, kid, a demon is always an actor, no matter how much he believes in what he's saying, and there never, ever was an actor yet who wouldn't instantly notice a member of the audience starting to walk out on his big scene. So Bruce knew, which made him a better actor than I'd have been willing to grant, since it didn't look as if anyone else had thought of what I said, of what had just occurred to me. If they'd have gone over and put it to him. Not me, though. I don't work that way. Besides, I didn't feel up to it. Nervy Anna enfolded me. I felt like pure hell. Maybe, I told myself encouragingly, the place is hell. But added, be your age, Greta. Be a real rootless, ruthless 29.
This is from Sassoon. The barrage roars and lifts, then clumsily bowed, with bombs and guns and shovels and battle gear. Men jostle and climb to meet the bristling fire. Lines of gray, muttering faces, masked with fear. They leave their trenches, going over the top, while time ticks blank and busy on their wrists. The Western Front, 1917.
Please don't, Lili.
Shall, my love.
Sweetling, wake up. Has the shakes?
I opened my eyes a little and lied to City with a smile and locked my hands together tight and watched Bruce and Lili quarrel nobly near the control divan. And I wished I had a great love to blur my misery and provide me with a passable substitute for change winds. Lili won the argument, judging from the way she threw her head back and stepped away from Bruce's arms while giving him a proud, tender smile. He walked off a few steps, praise be. He didn't shrug his shoulders at us like an old husband, though his nerves were showing, and he didn't seem to be standing introversion well at all, as who of us were. Lili rested a hand on the head of the control divan and pressed her lips together and looked around at us, mostly with her eyes. She'd wound a silk gray bandeau around her bangs. Her short gray silk dress without a waistline made her look not so much like a flapper, though she looked like that all right, as a little girl, except the neckline was scooped low enough to show she wasn't. Her gaze hesitated and then stopped at me, and I got a sunk feeling of what was coming because women are always picking on me for an audience. Besides, Sid and I were the centrist party of two in our fresh out of the shell place politics. She took a deep breath and stuck out her chin and said in a voice that was even a little higher and Britisher than she usually uses,
"We girls have often cried, 'Shut the door,' but now the door is jolly well shut for keeps."
I knew I'd guessed right, and I felt crawly with embarrassment because I knew about this love business of thinking you're the other person and trying to live their life and grab their glory, though you don't know that, and carry their message for them, and how it can foul things up. Still, I couldn't help admitting what she said wasn't too bad a start, unpleasantly apt to be true at any rate.
"My fiancé believes we may yet be able to open the door. I do not. He thinks it is a bit premature to discuss the peculiar pickle in which we all find ourselves. I do not."
There was a rasp of laughter from the bar. The militarists were reacting. Eric stepped out, looking very happy.
So now we have to listen to women making schemes. What is this place anyhow? Sydney Blessing Saturday evening sewing circle?
Beau and Sevensee, who'd stopped their pacing halfway between the bar and the control divan, turned toward Eric, and Sevensee looked a little burlier, a little more like half a horse than satyrs in mythology book illustrations. He stamped, medium hard, I'd say, and said, "Ah, go fly a kite." I found out he'd learned English from a demon who'd been a longshoreman with syndicalist anarchist sympathies. Eric shut up for a moment and stood there grinning, his hands on his hips. Lili nodded to the satyr and cleared her throat, looking scared. But she didn't speak. I could see she was thinking and feeling something, and her face got ugly and haggard, as if she were in a change wind that hadn't reached me yet, and her mouth went into a snarl to fight tears, but some spurted out, and when she did speak, her voice was an octave lower, and it wasn't just London talking, but New York too.
"I don't know how resurrection felt to you people, because I'm new and I love asking questions. But to me, it was pure torture, and I wished only I'd had the courage to tell Suzaku. I wish to remain a zombie, if you don't mind. I rather the nightmares. But I accepted resurrection because I've been taught to be polite, and because there is the demon in me I don't understand that always wishes to live. And I found that I still felt like a zombie, although I could flit about, and that I still had the nightmares, except they grown a deal vivider. I was a young girl again, 17, and I suppose every woman wishes to be 17. But I wasn't 17 inside my head. I was a woman who had died of Bright's disease in New York in 1929, and also because a big change blew my lifeline into a new drift. A woman who had died of the same disease in Nazi-occupied London in 1955, but rather more slowly because, as you can fancy, the liquor was in far shorter supply. I had to live with both those sets of memories, and the changed world didn't blot them out any more that I'm told it does those of any demon. And it didn't even push them into the background as I'd hoped it would. When some change fellow will say to me, "Hello, beautiful, how about a smile?" Or, "That's a posh frog, kiddo." I'll be back at Bellevue, looking down at my swollen figure and the light getting like spokes of ice. Or in that dreadful Jean's steep Stepney bedroom with Phyllis coughing herself to death beside me. Or at best, for a moment, a little girl in Glamorgan looking at the Roman road and wondering about the wonderful life that lay ahead.
I looked at Eric, remembering he had a long, nasty future back in the cosmos himself, and at any rate he wasn't smiling. And I thought maybe he's getting a little humility, knowing someone else had two of those futures. But I doubted it.
Because, you see, all my 3 lives, I've been a girl who fell in love with a great young poet she'll never met. The voice of the new youth and all youth, and she told her first big lie to get in the Red Cross and across to France to be nearer him. And it was all danger and dark magics and a knight in armor. And she pictured how she'll find him wounded, but not seriously, with a little bandage around his head. And she'll light a fag for him and smile lightly, never letting him guess what she felt, but only seeing her best self and watching to see if that made something happen to him. And then the Bosch machine guns cut him down at Passchendaele, and there couldn't ever have been bandages big enough, and the girl stayed 17 inside and messed about and tried to be wicked, though she wasn't very good at that, and to drink, and she had a bit more talent there, though drinking yourself to death is not nearly as easy as it sounds, even with a kidney weakness to help. But she turned the trick. Then a cock crows. She wakes with a tearing start from the gray dreams of death that fill her lifeline. It's cold daybreak. There's the smell of a French farm. She feels her ankles, and they are not at all like huge rubber boots filled with water. They are not swollen the least bit. They are young legs. There's a little window and the tops of a row of trees that may be poplars when there's more light. And what there is shows cots like her own and heads under blankets. And hanging uniforms make large shadows, and a girl is snoring. There's very distant rumble, and it moves the window a bit. Then she remembers the Red Cross girls many, many kilometers from Passchendaele, and that Bruce Marchand is going to die at dawn today. In a few more minutes, he's going over the top where there's a crop-headed machine gunner in field gray already looking down the sights and swinging the gun a bit. But she isn't going to die today. She's going to die in 1929 and 1955. And just as she's going mad, there's creaking, and out of the shadows tiptoes a Jap with a woman's hairdo and the whitest face and the blackest eyebrows. He's wearing a rose robe and a black sash which belts to his sides to samurai swords. But in his right hand, he has a strange silver pistol, and he smiles at her as if they were brother and sister and lovers at the same time. And he says, "Voulez-vous vivre, mademoiselle?" And she stares, and he bobs his head and says, "Missy wish live? Yes, no?"
Sid's paw closed quietly around my shaking hands. It always gets me to hear about anyone's resurrection, and although mine was crazier, it also had the Krauts in it. I hoped she wouldn't go through the rest of the formula, and she didn't.
"5 minutes later, he's gone down a stairs, more like a ladder to wait below, and she's dressing in a rush. Her clothes resist a little, as if they were lightly gummed to the hook and the stained wall, and she hates to touch them. It's getting lighter, and her cot looks as if someone were still sleeping there, although it's empty, and she couldn't bring herself to put her hand on the place if her new life depended on it. She climbs down, and her long skirt doesn't bother her because she knows how to swing it. Susaku conducts her past a sentry who doesn't see them, and a puffy-faced farmer in a smock coughing and spitting the night out of his throat. They cross the farmyard, and it's filled with rose light, and she sees the sun is up, and she knows that Bruce Marchand has just bled to death. There's an empty, open touring car chugging loudly, waiting for someone. It has huge, muddy wheels with wooden spokes and a brass radiator that says Simplex. But Susaku leads her past it to a downhill and bows apologetically, and she steps through a door.
I heard Eric say to the others at the bar,
"How touching. Now, shall I tell everyone about my operation?"
but he didn't get much of a laugh.
That's how Lillian Foster came into the change world with its still engraved nightmares and its deadliest pace and deadlier lassitudes. I was more alive than I ever had been before, but it was the kind of life a corpse might get from an ending electrical shocks, and I couldn't summon any purpose or hope, and Bruce Marchand seemed farther away than ever. Then, not 6 hours ago, a soldier in a black uniform came through the door, and I thought, it can't be, but it does look like his photographs. And then I thought I heard someone say the name Bruce. And then he shouted, as if to all the world, that he was Bruce Marchand. And I knew there was a resurrection beyond resurrection, a true resurrection. Oh, Bruce.
She looked at him, and he was crying and smiling, and all the young beauty flooded back into her face. And I thought, It has to be change winds, but it can't be. Face it without slobbering, Greta. There's something that works bigger miracles than the change.
And then the change winds die when the snakes vaporize the maintainer or the ghost girls introverted, and all three of them vanish so swiftly and silently that even Bruce didn't notice. Those are the best explanations I can summon, and I fancy one of them is true. At all events, the change winds died, and my past and even my futures became something I could bear lightly because I have someone to bear them with me, and because at last I have a true future stretching out ahead of me, an unknown future which I shall create by living. Oh, don't you see that all of us have it now, this big opportunity?
Huzzah for Sydney suffragettes and the WCTU. Beau, will you play us a medley of Hearts and Flowers and Onward Christian Soldiers? I am deeply moved, Lili. Where do the rest of us queue up for the great love affair of the century?
This concludes episode 6 of The Big Time for